It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brandon Southall. Dr. Southall is a marine bioacoustician, which is the combined study of noise and biology in the ocean environment. He is the president and senior scientist for Southall Environmental Associates and has been affiliated with UC Santa Cruz for many years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Southall.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in front of the commission. I spoke several times in the early 2010s, I guess we call them. I've got the challenge of giving you a lot of information in a short amount of time. There's a few slides I have that have more detail that I'm going to go into, but I've sort of left it so that we could get into some more if there are questions or people have more information. I spent 6 years working for NOAA during the time when the sonar issue was up to and at the Supreme Court, and have spent most of the time since then both with our small organization and academic groups, UC Santa Cruz and Duke, studying how sound affects marine mammals and trying to get to the bottom of what is going on with some of these stranding events. And as you'll see, we've sort of figured out the issue is a little bit broader than some of the things we thought it was about initially. So I'll try and kind of cut to the chase of some of these things, which are detailed topics, but really it's important to start with the fact that sound in the ocean is fundamental to the way animals operate, much like light is central to the way we operate. They use sound for all of these important things that they do. We figured out when we went in the ocean, if you want to find things, you use sound, you don't use radar, you don't use light. And so we've developed ways to look for things like sonar, like seismic surveys, because the physics favor sound as the way to communicate underwater. So from a conservation perspective, a lot of the things we need to ask are, can we use sound to eavesdrop on the ocean and understand where animals are going and what type of impacts there are? What type of effects are we having and under what circumstances? And then importantly, what can we do to minimize those kind of impacts? And my whole career has been sort of centered around those questions from a government perspective and then from an academic and conservation perspective. So the issue that you probably associate with sound in the ocean is whales stranding on beaches. That's what drove this issue to the front of newspapers and into the Supreme Court. That's at the end of the spectrum I have here of rare but really bad. Clearly, you don't want dead animals on the beach. But there's a whole range of things that can happen that are much more common leading up to that, from nothing to behavioral changes that cause animals to leave important habitat areas or have sort of physical types of effects. And I kind of bolded here that the things we've really focused on are the stranding issues and things that happen to hearing. Those are sort of dictated by the fact that we can actually study them a little easier by doing things like clinical assessments of them. But what I'll sort of build up to is we sort of missed the fact that the most common and some of the widespread but important things are things that aren't necessarily lethal or don't have these sort of dramatic effects. And I'll talk about behavioral responses and some physiological kind of things that we're starting to measure. So when I came into NOAA in 2003, the conventional sort of way of looking at this is you had one sound in isolation, and it had a zone around it based on how loud it was, and there was a threshold associated with a behavioral effect or a physical effect that were concentric circles. The problem is the world doesn't work like that. There are many sounds interacting in the ocean, natural and human, and they overlap with one another. So rarely do you have one type of event occurring simultaneously. The other is, much like light in this room, right? There are bright areas, there are dark areas. It's not sort of universally lit. We get these same phenomenons with sound. And the red shows loud and the blue shows not loud. And there are places, if you put a sound source where you could be a mile away from a sound source and not hear it, and be 30 miles away and hear it loudly at a different depth in the ocean, just based how things reflect. So there's complexity in the environment that was really not reflected in the way we made rules. And so that's as we've unraveled some of these things, some of the rules have necessarily become a little bit more complex. It's sort of like having one speed limit. Like what's the speed limit? What's a safe speed limit? Depends on if you're in a school zone or if you're driving a truck, if it's at night, if it's raining. We have these sort of caveats around things, and the original approach we started from was having a single speed limit, and we've had to sort of move beyond that a little bit. So I'm going to talk very briefly about hearing, because there's been a pretty major recent set of criteria that NOAA did release based on some things, and I'm going to spend most of my time talking about behavioral effects, partially because the consistency determination that we sought and got from this commission is partially why I'm updating you on this behavioral study that we did off of California. But right here in Santa Cruz, there's a lab at the Long Marine Lab that does work on hearing, where we can get things like these graphs here, which is basically like a picture of how well you hear. And think about a dog whistle. You can't hear a dog whistle, but a dog can hear a dog whistle. It's because it has a different filter in its ear that allows it to hear different frequencies. Think about a piano. We can hear from the bottom notes to the top notes, but other animals can hear lower notes than that, or much, much higher notes than our piano. And so we're sort of figuring out from studies like that have been done at the Long Marine Lab by training seals or other animals to do studies where they say, kind of like your kid with raise your hand if you hear a sound in your headphones. With the seals, we can do that. They just push on a little paddle with their nose because their flippers are small. But we can measure their hearing, and we can measure how sound affects their hearing directly. And in 2007, we published a paper that took everything we had at that point, which was pretty limited, and we tried to start this process of developing what we call acoustic criteria that moves beyond those single speed limits and says, okay, animals are different from one another. And these filters, the curves there, basically represent sort of different piano keys. So the whales have a really low set of keys, and the dolphins and porpoises that use echolocation like bats do have this really high set of keys, but they're different from one another. And that was the first time that anybody had ever done that in any species other than people. Last year, we published something that was more complex and has more sort of nuance to it, that separates things a little bit better. There's a little bit more science backing it. And we now have numerical values that say, based on where you fall on that piano, you could play a sound louder or quieter, and it would directly affect the hearing of animals. And I'm boiling all of this down into a couple of really kind of broad points here, and I'll try to summarize them quickly. This is still a rapidly evolving area. The thresholds are quantitative, which is what we want, and we've done a lot in a short amount of time, but there's a lot we still don't know. No one's taken a whale and put it in a lab and told it to push on a paddle, so we have to guess about things like whales based on reasonable kind of assumption, but you have to be more careful in areas like that where you don't have information. There's some evidence that certain species like porpoises, which live on our coast here, are more sensitive, quite a bit more sensitive than other species. And the bottom line on the bottom here is kind of the important one that I would lead up to. We've really focused on these hearing effects. And for most of these animals that live in noisy environments, it actually takes a lot of sound to influence their hearing, to hurt their hearing. And it makes sense that we focused on that initially because you think hearing would be affected the most. But they make loud sounds themselves. If you listen to the ocean, there's a lot of sound in the environment, and they're pretty resilient in terms of their hearing. And that's sort of, yes, there are some uncertainties, and there are some species that we're more concerned about, but for most of these species, it's pretty unlikely to have direct hearing effects. And in fact, in some ways, and I could give you some specific examples, when we really focus on these rare things, it can actually work against conservation because it takes our focus off of things that are a little bit more common that can also be significant. So I'll switch into that, and I want to spend the rest of the time that I have, for the most part, talking about behavioral effects. I just wanted you to know there's a whole process and new criteria that are in place for hearing, but we just have to be a little careful to focus on these rare things that are bad and miss the picture of things that are a lot more common. So there's a couple different ways we can look at studying how behavior is influenced by sound. You can just watch what's going on, and there's been some good work doing that. It's not a controlled situation, so there are things that you sort of miss from doing things experimentally. And the project that we came before the commission and requested a consistency determination was a field method where we were controlling the sound environment and looking at how animals responded to particularly Navy sonar sounds. So that project was called the Southern California Behavioral Response Study. It ran from 2010 to 2017. We're still publishing papers out of it. Full disclosure, funded by the Navy, involved some people from like the Naval Postgraduate School you'll see on there, but a lot of academic organizations, conservation organizations, was deliberately included all unclassified information, didn't require kind of clearing things through the Navy. We published and presented things in public settings and professional settings. So this was a pretty major effort that the Navy supported to understand how sonar affects marine mammals. And I've worked, I should have said maybe at the beginning, I've worked very closely with Mark Delaplane on this staff since my time at NOAA and through this project, and even since then, to sort of, you know, when Navy rules come out, to sort of interpret the science from my perspective in some of that. So Mark was pretty aware of this, and we came before you and told you about it. So now this has sort of happened, and the point of me giving you some of this is kind of what's the take home from it. So it involves putting tags on animals. Most of them are short-term things that you just approach a whale. That gives you a good sense of how big a blue whale is if you see a person there taken from an airplane. You come up, there's a very, very specific set of permits, IACUC authorizations to do this safely. You need really trained people to do this safely. Don't try this at home. But we put tags on whales so that we can track things that they do, how they move, how they dive, the sounds that they make. And then within the context of this experiment, we started with this simulation like a big speaker that presented Navy sonar. But we built up to and coordinated directly with ongoing training activities that they were already conducting. So with real full-scale ships, and these are the kind of ships that carry the sonar systems that have been involved in previous stranding events. We did this very carefully and with a number of protocols to prevent inducing the kind of effects that we're trying to understand and mitigate against. So there was a long process of coordinating with both the ships, and the Navy also uses sonars that are dipped out of helicopters, which are a whole different sort of set of things. We work directly with both of those systems in the context of things that they're already doing, things that are already ongoing and authorized under in Southern California on the SoCal operating range. So in the course of this project, we tagged over 150 animals of 8 different species. In the course of that, we learned a tremendous amount about some of these species nobody had even known anything about before, like Baird's beaked whales. We tagged one no one had ever known. How do they dive? What do they sound like? How do they feed? So there's a lot of just basic science that came out of this, and we did over 100 experiments over these 8 years, about 20 of those involving the real sonar sources. And so I'm going to give you 4 slides here that have a little more detail that I'm going to go into, and I hope you bear with me. I thought maybe having the detail would be useful if we wanted to talk about it. I've broken the kind of results down into new things that were developed, and in this case, we figured out some things that have really important implications of things like how do you use sound to count how many animals are out there. If you listen, you could hear 100 calls. Is that 100 whales calling one time or one whale calling 100 times? It helps to know how often they call. And we figured out how to do that through some technology evaluations. So have any of you ever heard the sound of like a blue whale or a fin whale played back? Right? So if we had a speaker in this room, it would be shaking the room, right? We figured out that if you take accelerometers on a tag, you can figure out that it's shaking on the one that's tagged and not the one that's right next to it. You would think just it's the loudest one, but not necessarily. Sometimes they're really close to one another. So we figured that out, which has broad implications for things like density estimation from just listening to the environment. Another one is if you've got a whole bunch of dolphins and you listen to them, that panel on the top right there it just sounds like a whole bunch of clicks. It's just a sea of clicks. But if you have two listening devices on it, the difference of arrival time between one and the other, if it doesn't change, it's the animal that it's on, and if it does change, it's an animal that's going by it. So there's just a lot, and there's a dozen other examples I could give you of new technology developments that came out of this kind of project. There was also a tremendous amount just about how these animals live, how they operate, how they feed, and the figure here basically shows that whales have handedness. They roll preferentially a certain direction. It also shows that differs based on what they're going after. And a lot of the papers here, and there's a dozen papers, this is half of them, that tell us how they are approaching the feeding environment and how the feeding environment influences what they do, are just, and I'm going to use the term context dependent a lot. And what I mean by that is what they're doing and how they respond to sound really depends on what's going on and what the environment is, what the situation is, which isn't really that surprising. It just hadn't been shown in this kind of way. So there's a lot of just basic information about how these animals behave. But the point of these studies was to measure directly what do they do when they hear different kinds of sounds. So Cuvier's beaked whales are the species that are most involved in stranding events in the Bahamas and the Mediterranean and other places. So we were able to tag Cuvier's beaked whales, expose them to both experimental and actual sonar, observe those animals afterwards and know they were okay. We're trying to measure the onset of certain type of responses, not the strongest type of response. We published a paper here, and there's some underlying statistics here, but if you just sort of see that red bar where there's an exposure, a whole bunch of behaviors change. Basically, the animals stop doing what they were doing. They break off of their foraging dives. They stop using these echolocation clicks, and they do something very different. So we're able to determine this change, the sort of duration of that change from the simulated sonar. Interestingly, when we have sound that's really far away from a real sonar event, we don't see these types of responses in Cuvier's beaked whales. So it's not like when they hear sonar at any level anywhere, they freak out. When things are closer to them or when they're louder, they tend to react more strongly, which is, again, not surprising, but we now have direct measurements of this in the species that we're the most concerned about, and we understand what the type of responses are. I mentioned the Baird's beaked whale. That's a fairly uncommon, we just have very little known about it. This was the first time anybody had measured any kind of behavior at all, and we measured some behavioral responses in there. So a lot of the things we figured out about this context dependency were from blue whales. And I'll say this pretty quickly. We figured out that what they're doing at the time, what the prey is like at the time, and how they change their behavior, and how far away the sound is really influences the probability of their responding. And if you think about that, like, that's not really that weird, right? Like, what is your behavioral response threshold? Scenario A, you're in a library. Scenario B, you're at a restaurant. You know, the level really depends on these other things, and that makes things hard for the people at NOAA or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to set rules, because it means you got more things to deal with, but it's just the world, and it's not really that surprising. So there's a lot of science that sort of get us to show those types of phenomenons, but it means that our rules need to be adaptive to accounting for these kinds of complexities. And this project showed this in more detail and specifically related to Navy sonar in ways that hasn't been done before. So kind of wrapping that up, there's just a whole lot that we figured out and new technologies that were done. We published 35 papers and counting out of this project. I can give copies of those to any of you that want any more information. There were high resolution changes measured in conditions where we know what the exposure is. So it's important and it's notable that the Navy is doing a lot of monitoring of things that they already have going, and some of these data are sort of feeding into like, what do you look for? But having that power of control, I think, is pretty important. And this new finding about what is happening influences the response probability is pretty important for not just Navy sonar, but offshore wind and marine hydrokinetics, which are issues that California is now looking at in different ways, alternative energy sources. This is important beyond Navy sonar. We just kind of got into it in a little bit more detail here. So I'm going to say just two other quick things, and then I'll wrap up and take questions if we have time. We've taken this project now and started to look at other species that people have sort of assumed aren't an issue, like dolphins, sometimes right on the bow of Navy ships that are projecting military sonar loudly. And so people think like, well, they must not really be bothered by this. They're really common. If you look at the Navy's EISs, the numbers of animals that they take, there's a lot of them, and a lot of them are common dolphins and bottlenose dolphins, and nobody's ever really been able to do much with them. We put some tags on these animals initially. They take them off. They spin and they jump, and they don't keep them on there. So we had to find. We want to know though, is there a way of assessing impacts correct or not? And so we developed some other ways to look at the responses, and these are also animals that are in groups. So think about if you tagged one bird in a flock of birds, you probably wouldn't get a good picture of the dynamic of how a flock of birds would react to something. Same thing with these highly social animals. So I've just got this in kind of one slide here, but we developed a study that looks without tags, and that also looks at behavior, but also starts to now look at what's going on inside the animal, what's physiologically happening with things like if we played a really loud sound right now and everybody got scared, you would actually have a cortisol response, a stress hormone response in your body that would happen. People haven't measured that before. So we came up with ways of doing this, where we're looking at this group of animals from an elevated vantage with a thing called a theodolite. That's like a surveyor's tool that's been used to get an idea of like a track of a whole group. We've developed methods from drones using aerial imaging from small UAS that flies over animals. We can track individual animals in a group at 1 second resolution to 2 centimeter accuracy, and see what the individuals within the group are doing. We can listen to the sound environment and look at changes in vocal response. And then we can get little tiny tissue samples with a common procedure called biopsy sampling to measure, and we have measured changes in blood cortisol as a function of sound exposure in these kind of experimental ways. I didn't really put too many results on here because this is not published yet, but I will tell you that for these species, common dolphins and bottlenose dolphins in particular, we're seeing strong behavioral changes, both movement and changes in group cohesion and structure, acoustic changes, and changes in blood cortisol at levels of sound that would be quite a bit below those that were predicted from some of the earlier assessments. So I think this is an important one. It's ongoing, but it raises the prospect of sort of bigger impacts on species that we thought were probably not very sensitive. And then I'm just going to end with just maybe a quick awareness of some things going on here in California that are really good developments that help us monitor the sound environment of the ocean better. NOAA is leading and this is a nationwide effort to monitor soundscapes in marine sanctuaries. There's 9 different sanctuaries, including the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary and the Channel Islands Marine Sanctuary in California, as well as a bunch of others. Here in Monterey, this is sort of incorporating some other things people were already doing. The Naval Postgraduate School had a recorder off the coast near Sur Ridge for quite a few years, and then MBARI has developed a real-time listening station. If you want to listen to Monterey Bay, you can go online at any point and listen to what Monterey Bay sounds like. It's usually boring, but sometimes there's whales. But there's also some other new deployments up on the shelf. So we now have 4 continuous recorders in Monterey Bay that we're monitoring and looking at things like how loud is a cruise ship going into Monterey? What do seal bombs sound like? I think I've got a seal bomb thing on here. So this is a new, relatively new issue with acoustics here locally. Fishermen use these underwater firecrackers basically to deter sea lions and other predators away from fishing nets. They're pretty loud. You can hear one, if someone sets one off anywhere in Monterey Bay, you can hear it in the entire bay. And MBARI is helping to sort of quantify those things. So there's a lot of good new partnerships and a good new technology being applied to understand the ocean acoustic environment. And then I just real quick, I'm working with this new nonprofit called California Ocean Alliance. We're bringing students out onto the water to teach them how we do marine science and marine conservation, including ocean acoustics. And I'm pretty excited about that opportunity. And then, so to sort of wrap this up, it's hard to overstate how important sound is to these animals. They use sound to see the world the way we see it visually in ways that we probably can't even really comprehend. The sonar systems that dolphins have are so fine-tuned, they can discriminate something that's 2 and 2.5 centimeters different, that's one that's 2 and one that's 2.5 centimeters difference at 300 feet away. Okay, so like, what would that look like? It would be probably visual. It would probably be like how we see things visually is the way they see the world acoustically. So it's really important to them. We know we're having a variety of different types of impacts. They're variable. Some of them are more common, and the sublethal ones are more common, and they may include some species that we haven't really focused on. So beaked whales and Navy sonar is still an important issue. There was a major stranding that happened in Ireland and northern UK and Iceland this last year that included hundreds of beaked whales of like 4 different species. So this is still an ongoing issue in other places. We don't have that here in our area immediately, but it's still an important issue. But we've just realized that things like moving animals away from important feeding areas or causing physiological stress is maybe more common and probably a little bit more widespread. This issue about context is sort of a whole new paradigm, and it makes things harder because thresholds don't really work in some contexts. So we're looking at things like response probability functions in different settings. There's a lot of new technology and better science coming. These projects, if you looked on those Monterey and California specific ones, there's a lot of different people that are required. You have different disciplines, different partnerships, and those are happening. So there is some good news, and I'll sort of end with good news. Seems like we get all bad news these days, and there are some really concerning things, I think, in some of the findings that we've had. But it's important to remember that sound is not like CO2 or DDT. It doesn't stay in the environment. It's ephemeral. You can actually turn it off or mitigate it in different ways, and the effects sort of go down. And people, are finding good ways around it. And we also need to inspire and enable the next generation. So I think with that, I'll stop. I'll maybe leave this up if we take any questions. There's a cool website called Discovery of Sound in the Sea that you can get a lot more information on, and I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. It's a lot of very valuable and somewhat disturbing information on some level. Commissioner Bochco?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is so meaningful to me. I don't remember the first federal consistency we had on sonar, but I think it was within the first year of when I was appointed, which is 9 years ago. And I remember we knew nothing. You know, the Navy would come in, and they were, at that point in our history, the Navy was not very cooperative with staff or anybody. And it was heartbreaking, and it was terrifying. And then the Supreme Court came down, and things got a little bit better. And then I remember 4 or 5 years later, we had our second consistency meeting, and it went, like, it was 180-degree difference in their attitudes. And I think, you know, this study is a part of the result of that. So I just want to thank you for this information and for the work you're doing. It just means the world to me. And I think, you know, the more collaborations you can get together, you know, maybe overseas, we can reach out to them somehow and get them on the same page, because you've already got so much information they can be benefiting from without having to spend the time and money like we've already done. So I just really wanted to thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Commissioner Hart?
Thank you. I want to just echo what Commissioner Bochco just said about my appreciation for the work that you're doing. It's absolutely incredible. I wanted to request the journal articles and a list of the articles and the sites, if I could get them, so whatever way. And I'm just curious, with regard to the journal articles, are they open access? Are they available to the public if the public's interested? Or what's the deal with that?
Yeah, increasingly so. There's a process called open access. Journals typically make you pay for that because journals make money off of people subscribing to them. But increasingly so, I'd have to look. But more than half of those are in open access journals, or all of them are available, and we just distribute them to people that request them.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, if there's PDFs that can be provided that the commission can put on our website that wouldn't otherwise be available to the public that you think are particularly important or interesting, and you could do it, you know,
Yeah.
legally, that would be great.
It depends on the journal. There's some copyright
I know
issues,
how it
but
goes.
yeah, I'll make all of them available, and I could flag which ones could be sort of openly distributed.
That would be fantastic. And in a continuing fashion is the new, particularly I was interested in, you know, the work that you say is coming. So thank you.
Yeah, probably the most important paper that's still coming is one where we're contrasting this simulation of the sonar with the actual sonar systems themselves. And the bottom line, I think, is that we're getting from the simulation, it's sort of like if you took a sound in this room and you played it at a certain level, and then you took the same sound source and you played it in the other room, but it was at the same level, you might be less likely to respond to the one that's in the other room because there's a part of your brain that's like, hey, that's over there. And the animals are doing that a little bit. And so it may mean that our predictions from the simulated sources overestimate the effects a little bit, but yeah, that's probably the most important one that's still coming.
Thank you. Other questions regarding the briefing? Commissioner Howell?
Just a quick question. So the most important publications are on your website?
Yeah, there's a lot of them that are already listed there, yeah.
Okay, that's what I was looking at. Thank you.
Yeah, but I'll provide you with a list of all of them, and I'll hyperlink them, and then you can get them from there.
Beautiful. Thank you.